After 10 years, 1 month, and 1 day on death row, Theodore Robert Bundy finally faced his fate in Florida. He was 42 years old when the electric chair's violent surge ended his life. But his name had already been carved into America's criminal history as one of the most cunning predators the nation had ever known, and as the architect of a killing spree that would terrorize 5 states and claim at least 30 lives.
Ted Bundy was an extreme variant of a sexual psychopath.
The morning air in Burlington, Vermont was crisp on November 24, 1946, when a child was born into a web of lies that would shape everything to come. The hospital room appeared ordinary enough. White walls, sterile equipment, the soft cries of a newborn. But nothing about this birth was what it seemed. The woman holding the baby wasn't his mother in the eyes of the world. She was his sister. The people he would call mother and father were actually his grandparents. From his very first breath, Theodore Robert Bundy was living a lie. The house on Elm Street seemed unremarkable from the outside, but within its walls, darkness festered. His grandfather's violent outbursts shattered the evening calm with disturbing regularity. Dishes flew across the kitchen. Doors slammed with thunderous force. The man young Ted believed was his father raged through the hallways, leaving fear in his wake. Meanwhile, his grandmother retreated deeper into her depression, disappearing for hours into the shadowy corners of their fractured home. Years later, when the truth finally emerged about his parentage, something fundamental cracked inside Ted's carefully constructed world. The revelation came not with gentle explanation, but like a sledgehammer to glass. His sister was actually his mother. His grandparents had been lying to protect the family's reputation. The foundation of his entire existence had been built on deception, and now it was crumbling beneath his feet. At the University of Washington, Ted Bundy perfected the art of becoming whoever people needed him to be. The campus sprawled before him like a hunting ground, though no one could have imagined what was growing behind his charming smile. He studied psychology with particular intensity, learning the mechanisms of the human mind with the focus of a predator studying his prey. His professors saw a bright, articulate student. His fellow volunteers at the crisis hotline heard a compassionate voice offering help to those in desperate need. But late at night, in the privacy of his small apartment, Ted practiced something else entirely. He rehearsed conversations, perfected his smile in the mirror, and studied the way people moved when they felt safe and unsuspecting. He was building a toolkit of manipulation, piece by careful piece. The rejection came like a physical blow. Elizabeth Klopfer, beautiful, educated, from a wealthy family, had seen through his facade just enough to walk away. The humiliation burned inside him, festering into something far more dangerous than wounded pride. As Ted watched her disappear from his life, he began to notice things about the women around him. The way they wore their hair, parted straight down the middle. The confident way they walked across campus. The trust in their eyes when a handsome, well-spoken young man approached them for help. The pattern was forming, though he wouldn't act on it for years. Every woman who would later fall victim to his brutality shared something with Elizabeth. Youth, beauty, intelligence, and that distinctive hairstyle that would become his calling card. They would pay the ultimate price for one woman's rejection. By 1974, the mask was complete. Ted Bundy had transformed himself into the perfect predator, hiding in plain sight among the very people he planned to destroy. The first disappearance shattered the peaceful routine of the University of Washington campus. January 31, 1974, a date that would mark the beginning of one of America's most terrifying killing sprees. Linda and Healy's basement room in her shared house appeared undisturbed at first glance. Books remained stacked on her desk. Her clothes hung neatly in the closet. The bed had been carefully made with military precision. But when her housemates looked closer, they found something that made their blood run cold. Blood. Spatters across the pillow where her head should have been. The sheets had been changed and the bed remade, But whoever had done it couldn't hide the dark stains that had soaked through to the mattress below. Linda had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only evidence of violence and a killer who was meticulous enough to clean up after himself. The months that followed became a nightmare for young women across the Pacific Northwest. Donna Gail Manson disappeared from Evergreen State College on March 12, 1974. Susan Rancourt vanished from Central Washington University on April 17. Kathy Parks was last seen at Oregon State University on May 6. Brenda Ball disappeared after leaving a tavern in Burien, Washington on June 1. Georgianne Hawkins was walking to her sorority house at the University of Washington when she encountered someone who would ensure she never arrived. Each disappearance followed a similar pattern that investigators would later recognize as Bundy's signature methodology. The victims were young, attractive, intelligent college students. Most had long brown hair parted in the middle. All had been approached by someone they trusted enough to let their guard down. And all had simply vanished, as if the earth had opened and swallowed them whole. But Ted Bundy was just getting started. His confidence was growing with each successful abduction, and his methods were becoming more sophisticated. He had learned that the right approach, the right words, the right display of vulnerability could overcome even the strongest survival instincts. A fake cast on his arm, a pair of crutches to suggest helplessness, the uniform of authority. These tools became his weapons, more deadly than any gun or knife because they bypassed his victim's natural defenses entirely. The summer of 1974 brought Bundy's boldest move yet. Lake Sammamish State Park on July 14th was crowded with families, couples, and young women enjoying the warm Seattle sunshine. Witnesses would later remember a handsome young man with his arm in a sling, approaching women and asking for help loading a sailboat onto his car. Most refused or found excuses to avoid helping a stranger. But Janice Ott, 23, agreed to walk with him to his vehicle. She was never seen alive again. Later that same afternoon, the same man approached Denise Naslund, 19, using an identical story. She, too, disappeared into the bright summer day, leaving behind friends who watched her walk away with someone they assumed was harmless. Two women vanished from a crowded public place, in broad daylight. The audacity of it sent shockwaves through law enforcement and the community alike. It was at Lake Sammamish that Ted Bundy made his first critical mistake. Multiple witnesses heard him introduce himself by name, Ted. They described his car, a tan Volkswagen Beetle. They remembered his story about needing help with a sailboat. For the first time, investigators had a clear description of their suspect. But Ted Bundy was already evolving, already planning his next move. The killing spree was expanding beyond Washington state. Utah, Colorado, Idaho, each new location brought fresh victims and confused law enforcement agencies that had no way of connecting the dots across state lines. Bundy was exploiting the fragmented nature of American policing, staying one step ahead of investigators who were working their cases in isolation. In Utah, Melissa Smith, the 17-year-old daughter of a police chief, vanished after leaving a pizza parlor. Laura M. disappeared after a Halloween party. Deborah Kent was last seen leaving a high school theater production. Each name added to a growing list that investigators were only beginning to understand represented the work of a single, methodical killer. The violence was escalating too. Early victims had been killed relatively quickly, but as Bundy's confidence grew, so did his sadism. He began keeping some victims alive longer, transporting them to remote locations where he could indulge his darkest fantasies without fear of interruption. The crimes were becoming more elaborate, more ritualized, more horrifying in their calculated brutality. By 1975, Bundy had refined his methods to a terrifying degree of efficiency. He could spot a potential victim, approach her with the perfect story, and lead her to her death with a skill that came from years of practice. He understood human psychology in ways that made him incredibly dangerous. He knew exactly which buttons to push to make someone trust him, even when their instincts might be screaming warnings. But even the most careful predators eventually make mistakes. And Ted Bundy's would come on a quiet summer night in Utah, when a routine traffic stop would begin to unravel the web of lies and violence he had been spinning for years. The headlights cut through the darkness of Granger, Utah, as Officer Bob Hayward conducted what should have been a routine patrol on the night of August 16, 1975. It was past midnight when he spotted the tan Volkswagen Beetle driving slowly through a residential neighborhood. Its lights off, despite the darkness. When Hayward attempted to pull the vehicle over, the driver suddenly accelerated, racing through stop signs and residential streets, in what became a high-speed chase through sleeping suburbia. The pursuit ended when the Beetle pulled into a gas station and the driver stepped out with his hands raised. He was young, clean-cut, articulate. Exactly the kind of person Officer Hayward would never have suspected of anything more serious than reckless driving. The man identified himself as Theodore Robert Bundy, a law student. He claimed he had been to a drive-in movie and gotten lost trying to find his way home. But when Hayward searched the vehicle, what he found chilled him to the bone. In the back seat lay what appeared to be a carefully assembled kit of violence: handcuffs, rope, an ice pick, a crowbar, trash bags, and a ski mask. Bundy claimed they were tools for household projects and recreational activities. To Officer Hayward, they looked like the instruments of abduction and murder. The arrest that night would prove to be the beginning of the end for Ted Bundy, though it would take years for the full scope of his crimes to be revealed. When detectives ran his name and description through their files, they found a match that made their hearts race. Carol Duranch, 18, had escaped from a man matching Bundy's description the previous November after he had lured her from a mall by impersonating a police officer. Duranch's story was harrowing in its detail. The handsome young man had approached her in the Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah, claiming to be Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department. He told her that someone had attempted to break into her car and asked her to come with him to file a report. Trusting his authoritative demeanor and official-sounding story, she had followed him to his tan Volkswagen Beetle. But something felt wrong as they drove. Instead of heading to the police station, he was taking her to a secluded area. When she questioned him, his demeanor changed entirely. The polite officer became something predatory and frightening. He pulled over and attempted to handcuff her, but in his haste, he accidentally cuffed both restraints to the same wrist. Duranch fought back with desperate strength, managing to escape from the vehicle and flag down help from passing motorists. Her description of her attacker matched Ted Bundy perfectly, down to the cast he had been wearing on his arm as a prop. More importantly, she had survived to identify him in a police lineup. For the first time, investigators had a living witness who could connect Bundy directly to an attempted abduction. The conviction that followed was for aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault, charges that carried a sentence of 1 to 15 years in prison. It should have been the end of Ted Bundy's reign of terror. Instead, it became merely an intermission in a much longer, more horrifying drama. Prison walls had never been designed to hold someone with Ted Bundy's intelligence and determination. From the moment he arrived at the Utah State Prison, he began planning his escape. He studied the routines of the guards, mapped the layout of the facility, and used his legal training to gain privileges that other inmates could only dream of. As his own attorney, he was allowed access to the law library without restraints, a freedom that he would soon exploit in the most dramatic way possible. June 7, 1977, dawned like any other day at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen, Colorado, where Bundy was being tried for the murder of Karen Campbell. He had been transported there from Utah to face charges that could result in the death penalty. But as he sat in the courthouse library, ostensibly researching his defense, Ted Bundy was actually planning something far more ambitious than legal arguments. The second-story window stood open to let in the warm summer air. Guards had become complacent, viewing the articulate law student as a low escape risk. After all, what kind of person would be crazy enough to jump from such a height? The answer, as it turned out, was someone who preferred death to a life behind bars. When the guards stepped away for their routine break, Bundy moved with practiced efficiency. He opened the window wider, gauged the distance to the ground below, and without hesitation, launched himself into space. The 25-foot drop should have been devastating, but somehow he managed to land and roll, sustaining only a sprained ankle. Within seconds, he had disappeared into the Colorado wilderness, leaving behind a courthouse in chaos and a manhunt that would capture national attention. For 6 days, Ted Bundy lived as a fugitive in the mountains around Aspen. He survived on stolen food and camping equipment, staying one step ahead of search teams that included bloodhounds, helicopters, and hundreds of law enforcement officers. The irony wasn't lost on investigators. The man they were hunting had spent years stalking victims in similar wilderness areas. Now he was using those same skills to evade capture. His freedom ended when a deputy sheriff spotted him driving a stolen car near Aspen. Even then, Bundy maintained his composure, greeting his captors with a smile and asking about the extent of the search effort. He seemed almost pleased by the attention his escape had generated. To Ted Bundy, even being hunted was a form of validation, proof that he was smarter and more dangerous than anyone had initially realized. But the brief taste of freedom had only whetted his appetite for more. Back in custody, this time under much tighter security, Bundy immediately began planning a second, even more audacious escape. He had learned from his first attempt, and this time, he would be far more careful about covering his tracks. The Glenwood Springs jail where Bundy was now held seemed escape-proof. The cell was small, the walls were thick, and the guards maintained constant surveillance. But they underestimated their prisoner's intelligence and determination. Over the course of several months, Bundy began implementing a plan so elaborate and patient that it seemed like something from a Hollywood thriller. First, he went on a strict diet, losing enough weight to squeeze through openings that would have been impossible for a larger man. He obtained a hacksaw blade, exactly how was never determined, and began the painstaking process of cutting through the steel plate in his cell ceiling. He worked only late at night, muffling the sound and carefully disposing of the metal shavings. During the day, he covered his work with books and papers, maintaining the appearance of a studious prisoner preparing for his upcoming trial. December 30th, 1977, was chosen for its timing. Most of the regular staff were enjoying holiday leave, replaced by less experienced guards who weren't familiar with Bundy's habits. That evening, he made his move. Squeezing through the hole he had spent months creating, Bundy crawled through the ceiling and into the guards' quarters above. There, he found civilian clothes that fit well enough to pass casual inspection. Within minutes of entering the ceiling, he was walking out the front door of the jail, nodding politely to the guard at the desk as if he were a visitor leaving after normal hours. By the time his escape was discovered the next morning, Ted Bundy had a massive head start. He traveled by car, bus, and train across multiple states, using stolen credit cards and false identities to stay ahead of the nationwide manhunt that had been launched in his wake. His destination was Florida, a state where he had no known connections and where he hoped to disappear permanently into anonymity. But Ted Bundy had never been able to suppress his violent urges for long. Within weeks of arriving in Tallahassee, the mask of normalcy he had worn for months began to slip. The predator was awakening again, and this time, his violence would reach new levels of brutality that would shock even hardened investigators. The Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University stood quiet in the early morning hours of January 15, 1978. Most of the young women inside were deep in sleep, exhausted from weekend activities and the demands of college life. The house appeared secure. Doors were locked, windows were closed, and nothing suggested the horror that was about to unfold within its walls. Ted Bundy approached the building shortly after 2:30 a.m., carrying a club, fashioned from oak firewood. His previous crimes had been carefully planned affairs, with victims lured away from safety to isolated locations, where he could work without interruption. But something had changed in Bundy during his months as a fugitive. The careful predator was giving way to something more frenzied and desperate. The door lock yielded to his efforts with surprising ease, a detail that would later fuel speculation about whether it had been properly secured. Once inside, Bundy moved through the darkened hallways, with the confidence of someone who had done this before. But instead of seeking a single victim to abduct, he began a rampage that would leave multiple women dead or wounded in their own beds. Margaret Bowman's room was the first to be violated. The 21-year-old was asleep when Bundy entered, giving her no chance to scream or defend herself. The attack was swift and brutal. He struck her head with the club, then strangled her with a nylon stocking. The violence was so severe that investigators would later determine she had been killed almost instantly, though Bundy wasn't finished with her body, even after death. Lisa Levy's room was next. The 20-year-old was also asleep when the attack began, but she may have awakened during the assault, fighting desperately against her attacker. The evidence suggested a struggle, overturned furniture, torn bedding, signs that she had tried to escape. But Bundy overpowered her with the same brutal efficiency he had shown with Bowman. She was beaten, strangled, and sexually assaulted, her body bearing bite marks that would later become crucial evidence in his conviction. The sound of the attacks apparently awakened other residents of the house. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner were found severely injured but alive, their survival attributed to either Bundy being interrupted or the weapon breaking during the assault. Both young women suffered skull fractures and required extensive medical treatment, but they lived to testify about the horror they had endured. Within 15 minutes of entering the sorority house, Bundy had killed 2 women and severely injured 2 others. The crime scene was unlike anything he had created before. Instead of the careful, methodical murders that had characterized his earlier crimes, this was an explosion of violence that spoke to a mind that was finally coming completely unhinged. But he wasn't finished. Within an hour of the Chi Omega attacks, Bundy struck again. Just 8 blocks away, he broke into the apartment of Cheryl Thomas, a dance student at Florida State University. Thomas awakened to find a man standing over her bed, club raised to strike. The assault left her with a fractured skull and permanent hearing loss, but she survived, adding another victim to the night's toll of terror. By dawn, Tallahassee was in chaos. Police cordoned off the Chi Omega house, which had become a crime scene of unprecedented brutality. Ambulances rushed the wounded to local hospitals, while investigators tried to make sense of what appeared to be a random attack by someone completely divorced from reality. The idea that all of these crimes had been committed by the same person, a fugitive from Colorado who had been hiding in their community for weeks, was beyond their initial comprehension. The attacks marked a turning point in Ted Bundy's criminal career. Gone was the careful predator who had evaded capture for years. In its place was something far more dangerous, a killer who had abandoned all pretense of self-control and was now striking with the desperate violence of someone who knew his time was running short. The terror wasn't over. 3 weeks later, Bundy would claim his final victim, and this time, his choice would prove that absolutely no one was safe from his predatory hunger. Lake City, Florida, seemed like the kind of place where nothing bad ever happened. The small community was built around family values, quiet neighborhoods, and schools where children could walk safely without their parents fearing for their safety. But on February 9, 1978, that sense of security was shattered forever when 12-year-old Kimberly Diane Leach disappeared from Lake City Junior High School. Kimberly was everything a parent could hope for in a daughter: bright, popular, involved in school activities, and blessed with a kind of innocent beauty that made adults smile when they saw her. She had forgotten her purse in her homeroom that morning and received permission to return and retrieve it. Witnesses saw her walking across the schoolyard, her long brown hair catching the sunlight as she moved with the confident stride of a young woman just beginning to discover who she might become. She was also seen talking to a man near a white van in the school parking lot. The witnesses, other students and a teacher, would later describe him as handsome and well-dressed, the kind of person who looked like he belonged around a school. He seemed to be asking directions, and Kimberly, raised to be polite and helpful, had apparently stopped to assist him. It was exactly the kind of trusting behavior that Ted Bundy had learned to exploit with deadly effectiveness. Kimberly Leach was never seen alive again. Her disappearance launched one of the largest search efforts in Florida history, with hundreds of volunteers combing through woods, swamps, and abandoned buildings in a desperate attempt to find her before it was too late. Her parents held press conferences pleading for her safe return, their faces etched with the kind of anguish that only comes from knowing your child is in mortal danger and being powerless to help them. For 8 agonizing weeks, Kimberly's fate remained unknown. Then, on April 13, 1978, her remains were discovered in Sewanee River State Park, hidden in an abandoned hog shed 40 miles from where she had disappeared. The murder of Kimberly Leach represented a new low in Ted Bundy's reign of terror. His previous victims had been college-aged women, chosen for their resemblance to the girlfriend who had rejected him years earlier. But Kimberly was just a child, an innocent who had shown him nothing but kindness in her final moments. Her murder proved that Bundy's violence had evolved beyond even the twisted logic of his earlier crimes. He was now killing simply because he could, because the act of taking life had become its own reward. The investigation that followed her disappearance would ultimately lead to Bundy's final capture. Witnesses had seen him at the school, his van was spotted in the area, and fiber evidence would eventually link him conclusively to the crime. But even as law enforcement closed in, Bundy continued his pattern of attempting to evade responsibility through charm and manipulation. His arrest came on February 15, 1978, when Pensacola police officer David Lee pulled over a tan Volkswagen Beetle for erratic driving. The man behind the wheel presented identification showing him to be Kenneth Raymond Meisner, but something about him seemed off to the experienced officer. A check of the license plate revealed that the car had been stolen, and a search uncovered stolen credit cards and other evidence linking the driver to multiple crimes. When fingerprints confirmed that Kenneth Raymond Meisner was actually Theodore Robert Bundy, one of America's most wanted fugitives, the case suddenly took on national significance. The charming law student who had escaped from custody twice was finally back in chains, facing charges that would almost certainly result in his execution. But even then, facing overwhelming evidence of his guilt, Ted Bundy refused to accept responsibility for his crimes. Instead, he embarked on a legal strategy that would drag his case through the courts for over a decade, using every appeal and delay tactic available while maintaining his innocence in the face of evidence that painted him as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. The courtroom in Miami buzzed with anticipation on June 25, 1979, as one of the most closely watched trials in American history began. Ted Bundy, representing himself with the arrogance that had characterized his entire criminal career, sat at the defense table looking every inch the respectable law student he had once pretended to be. But the evidence arrayed against him told a very different story, one of calculated violence and unimaginable brutality. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Witness after witness placed Bundy at or near the Chi Omega sorority house on the night of the murders. His credit card receipts showed he had been in the area. Physical evidence from the crime scene matched items found in his possession when he was arrested. Most damning of all was the bite mark evidence. Forensic odontologists testified that the wounds found on Lisa Levy's body matched Bundy's teeth with scientific precision. But perhaps the most compelling evidence came from Bundy himself. His decision to act as his own attorney meant that he would cross-examine the survivors of his attacks, forcing Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner to relive their trauma while facing the man who had tried to kill them. The spectacle was both fascinating and horrifying, a cold-blooded killer attempting to use his charm and intelligence to escape justice for crimes that had shocked the nation. Bundy's courtroom performance revealed the same personality traits that had made him such an effective predator. He was articulate, confident, and seemingly sincere in his protestations of innocence. At times, he appeared to be enjoying himself, treating the trial like an intellectual exercise rather than a proceeding that would determine whether he lived or died. Observers noted that he seemed to view the entire process as validation of his superior intelligence. Even when facing the electric chair, he couldn't resist the opportunity to demonstrate his cleverness to a captivated audience. The prosecution painted a different picture entirely. They described a man so consumed by his own narcissism that he viewed other human beings as nothing more than objects to be used and discarded. The evidence they presented, crime scene photographs, medical testimony, survivor accounts, created a portrait of violence so extreme and calculating that it seemed almost inhuman in its coldness. On July 24, 1979, after deliberating for less than 7 hours, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty on all counts. The reading of the verdict seemed to surprise Bundy, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. For just a moment, his mask of confidence slipped, revealing something like genuine shock that 12 ordinary citizens had seen through his performance to the truth beneath. But even then, facing the certainty of a death sentence, Bundy couldn't resist one final performance. When Judge Edward Cowart pronounced the sentence, death by electrocution, Bundy maintained his composure, even managing a slight smile for the cameras. It was as if he viewed even his own death sentence as merely another opportunity to demonstrate his superiority over the ordinary people who had condemned him. The judge's words would prove prophetic in ways that no one could have imagined at the time. "It is ordered that you be put to death by electrocution. Take care of yourself, young man. I say that to you sincerely. Take care of yourself, please. You're a bright young man. You'd have made a good lawyer, and I would have loved to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner." But Bundy's legal troubles were far from over. The state of Florida had additional charges pending against him. Charges that would result in a second death sentence and ensure that even if he somehow avoided execution for the Chi Omega murders, he would still face death for his crimes against the innocent. The second trial, held in Orlando in 1980, focused on the murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. If the first trial had been disturbing in its clinical examination of violence, the second was heartbreaking in its focus on innocence destroyed. Kimberly's parents sat in the gallery, forced to relive the worst moments of their lives as prosecutors detailed the final hours of their daughter's life. The evidence in this case was equally compelling but far more emotionally devastating. Witnesses had seen Bundy at Kimberly's school. Fiber evidence linked him to her body. His movements in the days after her disappearance matched the timeline of events perfectly. But beyond the physical evidence was the simple, tragic reality of what had happened. A child had trusted a stranger who seemed harmless, and that trust had cost her everything. During this trial, Bundy provided one of the most bizarre spectacles in American legal history. While being cross-examined by prosecutor Larry Simpson, he turned to Carolyn Boone, a former co-worker who had moved to Florida to support him during his trials. In front of the judge, jury, and packed courtroom, he asked her to marry him. When she said yes, he invoked an obscure Florida law that allowed couples to marry simply by declaring their intent in front of a judge.
Carol, do you want to marry me?
Yes.
And I want to marry you.
Yes.
And I do want to marry you.
You said you did.
The impromptu wedding was vintage Bundy, a calculated move designed to generate sympathy and create the impression that someone who knew him well couldn't possibly believe he was capable of such crimes. But it also revealed the depth of his manipulation, showing that even facing death, he was willing to exploit the emotions of someone who genuinely cared about him. The jury was unimpressed by his theatrics. On February 7, 1980, they convicted him of Kimberly Leach's murder.
The jury found the defendant, Theodore Robert Bundy, guilty of murder in the first degree as charged in count 1 of the indictment. So say we all, dated the 7th day of February 1980 at Orange County, Florida. Signed Patrick E. Wilski, foreman of the jury. As to count 2, we, the jury, found the defendant, Theodore Robert Bundy, guilty of kidnapping as charged in count 2 of the indictment. So say we all, dated the 7th day of February 1980.
And 3 days later, he received his second death sentence.
Therefore, it is the sentence of this court as to count one of the indictment that you, Theodore Robert Bundy, be adjudicated guilty of murder in the first degree, and that you be sentenced to death for the murder of Kimberly Leach. It is further ordered that you, Theodore Robert Bundy, be taken by the proper authorities to the Florida State Prison and there be kept and closely confined until the date of your execution is set. In this case, the court finds that jurisdiction exists for the entry of an order by this court retaining jurisdiction.
Ted Bundy would spend the next 9 years on death row, filing appeal after appeal while maintaining his innocence and continuing to manipulate anyone willing to listen to his lies. But time was running out for America's most notorious serial killer. The appeals process, no matter how skillfully managed, couldn't continue forever. Eventually, the state of Florida would claim the life of the man who had taken so many others, and when that day came, the nation would watch with a mixture of relief and fascination as one of history's most evil men finally faced justice. Florida State Prison in Rayford became Ted Bundy's final home, but even behind bars, he continued to manipulate and control those around him. Death row was supposed to be a place of punishment and reflection, where condemned men would spend their final years contemplating their crimes and seeking redemption. For Bundy, it became another stage for his performance, another audience to charm and deceive. His cell was small and Spartan, but Bundy transformed it into something resembling a law office. Legal briefs covered every surface, evidence of his obsessive efforts to overturn his convictions through the appeals process. He corresponded with attorneys, journalists, and admirers from around the world, maintaining a network of supporters who believed in either his innocence or his rehabilitation. To many of them, he presented himself as a victim of overzealous prosecution and media sensationalism. The marriage to Carol and Boone proved to be more than just a courtroom stunt. She moved to Florida to be closer to him, visiting regularly and maintaining her belief in his innocence despite the mounting evidence of his guilt. Their relationship produced one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire Bundy saga. In 1982, she gave birth to a daughter, Rose, who was unmistakably his child. How conception occurred while Bundy was on death row remained a mystery that prison officials never satisfactorily explained. Some suspected bribery of guards, others pointed to the relatively lax security during conjugal visits in the early 1980s. Regardless of the mechanics, the birth of his daughter added another layer of complexity to Bundy's legacy. Somewhere in the world was a child who carried the genes of one of America's most prolific killers. For several years, Boone remained devoted to Bundy, bringing their daughter for visits and maintaining her belief that he had been wrongly convicted. But as the evidence continued to mount and Bundy's appeals continued to fail, even her faith began to waver. By the mid-1980s, she had quietly moved away from Florida, taking their daughter with her and disappearing from Bundy's life as completely as his victims had disappeared from theirs. During his years on death row, Bundy also became a subject of intense study for behavioral scientists and criminal profilers. FBI agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler conducted extensive interviews with him, hoping to gain insights that could help them catch other serial killers. Bundy proved to be a fascinating subject, intelligent, articulate, and seemingly willing to discuss the psychology of murder in clinical detail. But even these conversations were manipulative performances. Bundy revealed just enough information to keep the interviews going while withholding crucial details that could have solved cold cases or brought closure to grieving families. He understood that his knowledge made him valuable, and he used that value to maintain some measure of control even from his cell on death row. As his execution date approached, Bundy's strategy shifted from denying his guilt to bargaining with it. He began offering confessions to unsolved murders in exchange for delays in his execution, dangling the possibility of closure for families who had been waiting years for answers about their missing loved ones. It was a cruel final manipulation, using the pain of grieving families as leverage in his desperate attempt to postpone his death. The confessions, when they finally came, were chilling in their detail and scope. Bundy admitted to murders in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. At least 30 victims by his own count, though investigators believe the true number might be much higher. He described his crimes with the same detachment he might use to discuss the weather, showing no remorse for the lives he had destroyed or the families he had shattered. But even in confession, Bundy couldn't resist one final attempt at manipulation. In January 1989, just days before his scheduled execution, he sat down with Dr. James Dobson, a Christian psychologist and radio host, for what would become his final interview. In that conversation, Bundy claimed that his crimes had been fueled by an addiction to violent pornography that had warped his mind from an early age. The interview was vintage Bundy, a mixture of apparent insight and calculated deflection that allowed him to present himself as both victim and perpetrator. By blaming pornography for his crimes, he was attempting to redirect responsibility away from his own choices and onto societal forces beyond his control. It was a final con, designed to shape his legacy and perhaps generate sympathy even as his execution loomed. Critics saw through the performance immediately. Bundy had spent years denying his crimes, then years bargaining with confessions, and now, in his final days, he was attempting to position himself as a victim of media influence rather than a predator who had chosen to kill. The timing of these revelations, coming only after all his appeals had been exhausted, suggested they were motivated more by desperation than genuine remorse. As January 24, 1989, dawned, Ted Bundy prepared for his final performance. Outside the prison walls, something unprecedented was taking place. Hundreds of people had gathered to celebrate his impending death. They carried signs reading, "Burn, Bundy, burn," and "Tuesday is Friday." Vendors sold T-shirts emblazoned with "Bundy Barbecue" and other macabre slogans. The atmosphere was part tailgate party, part lynch mob, a disturbing carnival atmosphere that reflected just how deeply Bundy's crimes had affected the American psyche. Inside Florida State Prison, the mood was far more somber. Bundy spent his final hours in the death watch cell, a bare concrete room just steps from the electric chair that would end his life. He had declined to order a special last meal, so prison officials served him the standard fare: steak, eggs, hash browns, toast with butter and jelly, milk, juice, and coffee. Witnesses reported that he barely touched the food, his legendary charm and confidence finally beginning to crack under the weight of his approaching execution. At 7 a.m., the prison guards came for him. Bundy walked the short distance to the execution chamber with steady steps, though observers noted that his face had gone pale and his hands were trembling slightly. The electric chair, nicknamed Old Sparky by death row inmates, sat in the center of a sterile room, surrounded by witnesses who had come to see justice finally served. The witnesses included reporters, law enforcement officials, and representatives of victim families, who had waited over a decade for this moment. Among them sat survivors of his attacks, women who had looked into Ted Bundy's eyes and lived to tell about it. For them, this wasn't a spectacle or a news story. It was the end of a nightmare that had haunted them for years. As the guards strapped him into the chair, Bundy's composure finally began to completely deteriorate. The man who had charmed his way out of countless situations, who had escaped from custody twice, who had manipulated everyone, from judges to FBI agents, was facing the one reality he couldn't talk his way out of. His final words, spoken to his attorneys, Jim Coleman and Fred Lawrence, were simple and surprisingly human. "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." The executioner, hidden behind a partition, threw the switch at exactly 7:06 a.m. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through Bundy's body, causing it to strain against the leather restraints. Smoke rose from the electrodes attached to his head and leg. His hands clenched into fists, then slowly relaxed as the current was turned off. At 7:16 a.m. on January 24, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, the crowd erupted in cheers and celebration. Fireworks lit up the morning sky. Car horns honked in celebration. People danced and sang songs about Bundy's death. It was a reaction unlike any other execution in modern American history. A collective expression of relief that one of the nation's most feared predators would never kill again. The celebration was disturbing in its intensity, but it reflected something deeper about the impact Bundy had on American society. He had shattered the comfortable assumption that evil came with obvious warning signs. His victims had been killed by someone who looked like their ideal boyfriend. Handsome, educated, charming, and seemingly trustworthy. He had proven that monsters could hide behind the most appealing masks, and his death felt like the only way to ensure that particular monster could never hurt anyone again. In the hours following his execution, Bundy's body was cremated at a facility in Gainesville, Florida. His ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location in the Cascade Mountains of Washington state, the same wilderness area where he had dumped many of his earliest victims. It was a final cruel irony that his remains would rest in the same mountains where so many young women had drawn their last breaths at his hands. The aftermath of Bundy's execution revealed the true scope of his impact on American law enforcement and society. His case had exposed critical weaknesses in the way police agencies communicated across state lines, leading to the development of databases and information sharing systems that would help catch future serial killers more quickly. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit had used him as a case study in developing criminal profiling techniques that would prove invaluable in future investigations. But perhaps most importantly, Ted Bundy had forced America to confront an uncomfortable truth about the nature of evil. He had shown that predators didn't always look like monsters. Sometimes they looked like the person you might want to take home to meet your parents. His crimes had changed the way women thought about their safety, the way parents protected their children, and the way society viewed the masks that evil could wear. The families of his victims received varying degrees of closure from his death. Some felt that justice had finally been served, that the man who had destroyed their loved ones had paid the ultimate price for his crimes. Others found that execution couldn't heal wounds that had been festering for over a decade, couldn't bring back daughters and sisters and friends who would remain forever young in their memories. For the survivors, women like Carol Duranch, Karen Chandler, and Kathy Kleiner, Bundy's death meant that they could finally stop looking over their shoulders, stop wondering if he might somehow escape again and come looking for them. They had lived for years with the knowledge that the man who had tried to kill them was still breathing, still charming reporters and manipulating the system. His execution meant that chapter of their lives could finally be closed. The true number of Bundy's victims remains unknown to this day. His final confessions revealed at least 30 murders, but investigators believe the actual count could be much higher, perhaps 50, 70, or even more than 100. He had traveled extensively during his killing years, and cold cases across the country bear similarities to his known methods. Some of those cases may never be solved, leaving families without answers and allowing Bundy to take some of his secrets to the grave. In death, Ted Bundy achieved a twisted form of immortality that he had perhaps craved all along. His name became synonymous with pure evil, his story retold in countless books, documentaries, and films. He had wanted to be famous, to be remembered as someone special and superior to ordinary people. In the end, he got his wish, but as one of history's most reviled monsters rather than the respected figure he had once hoped to become. The Ted Bundy case marked a turning point in America's understanding of serial murder and criminal psychology. Before Bundy, the public image of a serial killer was someone obviously disturbed, disheveled, antisocial, clearly dangerous. Bundy shattered that stereotype, proving that the most dangerous predators could be the ones who seemed most normal, most trustworthy, most like the people we encounter every day. His legacy lives on in the changes his crimes brought about. Better police communication, improved criminal profiling, increased awareness of personal safety, and a deeper understanding of the psychology of predators. But perhaps most importantly, He serves as a permanent reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. Sometimes it comes wearing a charming smile, speaking in a confident voice, and offering help to those who need it most. On that January morning in 1989, when the electric chair finally claimed Ted Bundy's life, America didn't just execute a serial killer. It closed the book on one of the darkest chapters in the nation's criminal history. The monster was dead, but the lessons his crimes had taught would echo through law enforcement and society for generations to come. In the end, perhaps that is Ted Bundy's most lasting contribution to the world. Not the lives he destroyed, but the knowledge his destruction provided to help prevent future tragedies. The cheers that erupted outside Florida State Prison that morning weren't just celebrating the death of one man. They were celebrating the triumph of justice over evil, of civilization over chaos, of light over the darkest impulses of human nature. Ted Bundy had finally faced his fate, and America could breathe a little easier knowing that one of its most dangerous predators would never kill again.